Good evening. Good to see you all here. Nice to meet a bunch of you. And it's been a good time. It's my first time at the Cycle of Influence. I'll do an introduction of myself, and then I'll let these guys introduce themselves. They're very, very serious experts in this field. I was the editor for Electric Bike Action magazine for the past 7 years, until its untimely demise in February. So I've been about all things e-bike for quite a while. Actually goes back to Lee Iacocca in the late 90s. I did all the photography for eBike and some of the initial photography for Zero motorcycles when they first launched. Rick?
Hi, I'm Rick Vosper. Some of you know me from my columns in Bicycle Retailer. I started in the bike business in 1980, lifting boxes in the specialized warehouse straight out of college. Since that time, I've been in and out of the bike business. I ended up being director of marketing for Specialized about 2000. I was director of marketing for Cervelo, but I also worked in the advertising side of the business as a copywriter and later as a creative director. And that's where I met Sergio for the first time. What year was that, Sergio? It was like 1995, I think. Well, Troxel Helmets wanted to take a run at the specialty retail market. So they called in Sergio and me, never met, never worked together before, and did one ad for them, and that was sort of the end of the Troxel helmet boom. No, I think the ad ended up working pretty well. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
All right. My name's Chris Nolte. I'm the owner of Propel. We have a couple of e-bike shops. I started in New York when e-bikes were illegal, 2011. Felt a little bit like a drug dealer back then. It was kind of an interesting time. And I moved from where I started out on Long Island to Brooklyn in 2015 to set up our shop there because I felt like that's where they needed it the most. And they were even more illegal there because there was even more laws against them at that time. I felt like I really needed to do that. This has kind of been my life's mission since 2011, since I got into it, but probably more so in 2014 when I realized that this is really a transportation solution. And you know, as Steve mentioned earlier, I think this really has the potential to actually bring some level of world peace, if you will. I mean, it might sound a little overly idealistic, but I drove fuel trucks in Iraq and didn't really like what was going on there, and I felt like I needed to do something different, and so that's what I kind of got into this, and been involved in all sorts of different things. I'm like a bunch of advisory boards and with Bosch and different things like that, and we're really trying to help to set standards in the e-bike industry because, I mean, the bike industry has no standards, but the e-bike industry has perhaps even lower standards. It's kind of a weird scenario, but so that's kind of a lot of what I've been focused on, and we primarily focus on commuter and cargo bikes.
All right. Well, and so with the bike boom, I mean, how is the industry right now, from your point of view?
From my side as a retailer, it's not fun. It's a challenging time. I mean, it's just I feel confident we'll get through it, but I think everybody's dealing with too much inventory, and we grew a lot during COVID, and now we're kind of got to like pull it back a little bit, which is it's a tough experience. I mean, we have a lot of amazing staff and people that are really passionate and excited about this stuff, and it's it's tough to have to contend with. We might have to make some changes here, but overall, I feel like we're moving in the right direction. I for one, probably the minority. I'm actually excited about a lot of the kind of safety requirements that are kind of coming down the line. I feel really unfortunate to be in the minority in that perspective, but I'm not really much of a stranger to that point, Yeah.
All right. Well, talking about getting into legislation just a little bit, E-bikes being a very disruptive technology and rapidly changing, like, much faster than legislation can catch up. Rick, what do you think as far as, what should we be focusing on in that direction?
There's something that the people in this room are not as aware of as you might be, which is that the specialty retail end of the e-bike industry is just the tip of the iceberg. And the majority of e-bike sales are brought in and sold direct to consumers. And a lot of these are very inexpensive e-bikes. They're the ones we're having the safety problems with, which I'm sure we'll be talking about in just a little while. But they're in the same boat as all the rest of us. And one of the things the safety regulations are going to do is help protect us from those poorly built, unsafe bikes that are out there under a lot of people. You see kids zooming around on these $500 e-bikes. Those are the bikes they're zooming around on. So I think there's a big opportunity, and I'm sure we'll develop this topic a little more.
Chris, any thoughts?
Yeah, well, there was the CPSC meeting back in the end of July, and that seemed to be, it was 3.5 hours, and I watched the whole thing online. You guys can check it out if you feel so inclined, but I could give you the synopsis that basically pretty much everybody represented at that meeting was requesting the CPSC to take action and make UL a requirement. Many will say, like, okay, well, is UL the only thing? Can't we accept other things? Can we accept EN 15194 or something like that? But the reality is it's not, that regulation is not written for the US. It's not really so compatible, and UL is kind of our best bet right now. And it was interesting to see that and to see kind of pretty universal support for that. So I appreciate that. I look forward to that, because I do agree that, yeah, the majority of the products out there are, kind of direct to consumer, and there's so many different models. I mean, there's business models, but also individual models. But there's businesses that can ship directly from China. It doesn't go through customs. It just goes directly to the customer, and that creates all sorts of weird challenges. It's like, if you have a product liability issue, good luck trying to sue somebody in China for that one. I mean, and then, there's a lot of issues. So that the CPSC, hopefully they will make some sort of requirement, so that will help to some extent. But the other big challenge that comes up is this de minimis rule, which currently anything under $800, it basically doesn't go through customs. It used to be somewhere, I think it was $150. But somehow it was raised, and this is something that's impacting so many different industries. But we have that, and then we have the tariff exemptions and stuff like that. And so I look to places like Europe, where it seems like they don't have this issue so much, and they have a lot of these things in place. So one, there's a 67% tariff on most of the products being imported, and as such, they really have a blooming industry there. And not to mention, they do have some required safety regulations, even though they're self-certified, and there's some issues with that as well, that there's a lot of companies that are saying that they meet the requirement, but they don't actually meet the requirement. So it's a lot of weird things going on in the industry, and I guess it's just symbolic of, like, the industry being young as it is. We got a lot of pirates running around, it's kind of the best way to describe it.
The tariffs here are not in place right now. Is that true?
So there's an exemption which was just renewed. It was set to expire last Wednesday, and it was just renewed to December 31st. Currently, the administration says that they're reviewing it. I mean, they're studying it. They're trying to understand it. And I think that there's some of it's political, as far as, like, okay, well, we don't want to support something that, that Trump put in place or whatever. There's all sorts of weird scenarios there. I mean, Biden was just in Vietnam. I don't know if that's related at all. Like, okay, if we can kind of shore up our relations there, maybe that can make it easier to deal with some of these other things. But Yeah, there's the challenges run deep for sure.
Well, with even if the 25% tariff comes back, do you think that's going to bring any manufacturing stateside or encourage that?
Well, I think that there's a big need. I mean, I think that a lot of the supply chain stuff that exists today, some of that could be helped. I mean, many would know more about this than I, but I think there's some way to address that. But I mean, if you look at Europe, yeah, it's 67%. It's a lot more significant than 25%. And then you have stuff that, it's like, okay, well, it's made in China, but it's imported from Vietnam or Taiwan or whatever, and this is going on all over the place, and everybody's overwhelmed. That's the reality. Like anybody that's responsible to legislate on this or to deal with it, as you said, the technology moved too fast. Nobody can keep up with it. Everybody's overwhelmed, from the fire department to the customs to CPSC, and they're all just trying to figure out how to make sense of it. So that's kind of what I'm seeing, and I feel somewhat of a personal responsibility to try to help others navigate that. I think many just say, like, leave it be and let us make our money while we can. But I say a lot of these businesses are basically putting like ticking time bombs out there, and who knows when it's going to end up, just devastating your business, and not to mention all the people's potential lives, or whatever, it could be devastated or have been already as a result of these things. So. And I think the problem's a lot more acute when it's in cities, when you have people living on top of each other. So you're not just impacting, your car in your garage that's next to your e-bike, but it's actually like, people are being seriously injured and dying. And many would say, and I know, Rick, you said, it's not so much the bigger brands or the specialty retail brands, but there's everybody has some level of complicitness in this scenario, and it's a challenging thing, and it's, I don't know, it's tough to talk about this sometimes, but
Sure. Rick, I'm going to address this to you first. I'm sure Chris will want to chime in. But with all the reports of fires, especially in New York, and they're calling them e-bikes, whether they are e-bikes or not, I don't think there's enough information there. But how much do you think is sort of media hype, and how much do you think is like real danger?
Well, the fact of the matter is there are fires, and they're injuring people and killing people. And when we look at the batteries that are involved in the fires, they overwhelmingly come off cheap, de minimis, imported to the U.S. without customs inspection. There's no UL certs on them, and that's the reason that Europe does not have as much of a problem as we have, because they don't have as many of these dirt cheap bikes out in the population. So the solution needs to be several fold. One of them is de minimis reform. And I know there's people for bikes who are working on that. And I sent a text to Bob Marchavicius, who some of you may know. He's one of the leading people with People for Bikes, talking about de minimis reform, and as asking what the status is. Hadn't heard back from him. But if we can do something about that, we can put an end to the cheap, underdeveloped, under-constructed bikes out there, and that's going to take care of a lot of our battery fire problems. But yeah, for sure, there's media hype about it. It's a fire, and media loves to report on fires.
Well, but if somebody's house burns down for some other reason, it's not as big a news. It's like
Correct.
Anytime a Tesla drives off a cliff, they call it a Tesla. If somebody did that in a Ford Ranger, they wouldn't care. They wouldn't report it.
It's true, absolutely.
So e-bikes kind of are vilified by some people. Chris?
yeah, I mean, I get where you're coming from. I think that, so for one, outside of New York City, most fires are not investigated to the extent that they're investigated in New York City. Most fire departments don't have the resources. the New York City Fire Department in a lot of ways sets a standard for that, right? And the challenge is the way that CPSC works, and the reason why this is being reported as it's being reported in a very specific and focused way is because FDNY, and they were at the CPSC meeting, and you could hear from the Commissioner Kavanaugh, which had a press conference at my shop last week. You know, they are requesting the federal government to act, and the only way that they're going to act is if they have data. And so basically, and so I will say that, yeah, maybe a lot of those products might not necessarily meet our like classic definition of an e-bike. Some might be an electric scooter, some might be some of those different sort of things, but they are all very much in this like e-mobility, small scale, you know, whatever you want to, but you know, they're calling e-bikes. Yeah, it definitely gives a bad name to e-bikes, and there's many other repercussions that are coming from that, including a lot of buildings are just saying you can't have an e-bike inside of it. I mean, and this is spreading beyond New York City as well. So we had, as you know, discussed before, like the trail access and stuff like that. But okay, so so the data thing, this is one thing that's really important. So CPSC, most people would probably think that they say, okay, you're here to protect the consumer. You would proactively act and say, you know what, there's a potential hazard here. We're going to create a regulation. It's not how it works. The way it works is they need to have a statistical analysis of enough data to show that it's a serious hazard and causing enough death and destruction or whatever else. And, you know, Europe works a little bit differently, and that's another reason why they're you know, so one, their de minimis is, I think it's like $150 equivalent of US dollars, so significantly less. So basically no e-bike would be allowed to pass through that. But the other, with the way that they create regulation, they do it proactively, and they'll say, you know what, let's create some rules, let's create some base ground rules, and we'll continue to review them and refine them. But yeah, so, you know, definitely a lot of media hype around it, and it's causing all sorts of repercussions, but yeah, it's tough to say like how you're going to get action otherwise, and I think the problem, unfortunately, has already gotten so great that the reaction to it is going to have some pretty like grave results long term for the industry. Because if you can't take an e-bike on a subway, if you can't take an e-bike into your building, all these sort of things, like it's having a really significant impact. A lot of schools, a lot of colleges are saying no e-bikes, no e-scooters. And these are like perfect mobility devices for these populations, but now suddenly they're no longer accessible just when we're getting our start here. And so that's the stuff that, for me, like, you know, putting my blood, sweat, and tears into this like business, to see that being stripped away, it's really kind of scary, you know.
Were you telling me about the bike shops that are charging batteries, like a whole wall of them?
Oh yeah,
where they're plugged into other plugs and stuff, Clark Griswold style.
well, that's other so there's so many things that are specific to New York that don't really exist in most other places. I mean, New York City, there's probably the highest density at electric bikes at anywhere in the country, and the overwhelming majority of people using them are delivery workers. And basically, if you go into a shop that is servicing, you know, this community, many of them have really unsafe practices, and one of them, as mentioned, you know, they could be charging, you know, 50 batteries just, you know, lined up on a wall, and all sorts of cubbies with power strips and different things like that, and that is a lot of, you know, a lot of these fires and different things like that. And you got to think too, like, they're being used under the harshest conditions. The busiest time for delivery workers is in the wintertime, you know, when nobody wants to go out of their side of their house. So these guys are riding their e-bikes in the winter with snow, salt, in some of the roughest roads out there. And they're just, you know, really beating on these things, you know. Want somebody to test your product, that'd be a good people to do so. I mean, but yeah, a lot of those shops actually are shut down over the past couple of weeks, actually. What happened was, there was a shop that was inspected by the fire department in August, and they wrote a violation. You're in violation. And so this is the thing too. You got to understand, like, a lot of these different enforcement bodies, they don't have the legal tools to appropriately enforce things. You would say, like, okay, that's a serious hazard. Do something about it, right? So what do? So they write a violation. Person goes to court, and they pay a $4,000 fine, and they continue to operate. What happened is this shop that got a violation in August, later that year, actually 4 people died as a result of a fire that was caused by that shop. And so the fire department says, like, listen, whatever the rule is or however this thing's working, like, we're shutting these shops down. Like, this is, they in their words, we have blood on our hands, and so it's, as I said, it's a really challenging situation to put it lightly, but they're, in New York, they're taking it seriously, and this is what's going to come to the rest of the country. I foresee. I mean, many could say, like, oh, they're doing that in New York, they're not going to do it here. I'll tell you this. So New York City is the biggest fire department in the country, one of the biggest in the world, and they have the most resources. So they also have the most research and development, and they're publishing information, and there's symposiums that they're speaking at, and whatever the case may be. And so all the other fire departments, they don't have those resources, so they're looking to New York City. And so that's what's going to be the standard. And so the first thing that actually got implemented was last year, 2022, the fire code was updated, and it was a requirement to have UL. That was the requirement of the fire department. And then later, there was a bill introduced to make it illegal to sell a product that's not UL listed, which that new law comes into effect September 16th this year, so a couple days. And then so a lot of shops will not be able to continue to operate as a result of that. It's a $1,000 fine per model, and I guess in subsequent offenses, they'll eventually be largely shut down as a result of that. Yeah.
Let's switch gears a little bit, going into a different area of regulation. People that modify their bikes to be above the legal limit as far as speed or power. Thoughts?
This is there's a lot of hue and cry about this in Europe. I'm not hearing about it so much in the United States, but of course it can happen, and you can go on Amazon and get hop-up kits for your e-bike that's going to make it go faster. But I don't know that it's as large a problem as the media has made it out to be. What do you think, Chris?
So I think this is another issue where enforcement is like, they just don't know what to do, and it just, and I think that whose responsibility is it? Is it CPSC's responsibility? Is it, DOT? Is it the police department? All these sort of things. Everybody kind of points finger. Nobody wants to touch it, and it's because it's messy, and but yeah, I see it as a big issue, and something that I'm sure the CPSC is looking at, and it's yeah, I mean, technically there's some pretty serious fines if you do allow it, but so far as I'm aware, I'm not aware of anybody that's actually gotten in trouble for it yet. But to my understanding, you could, because I guess it's technically like you're selling an off-road vehicle, but you don't have, likely you don't have all the right, paperwork required to have something for that market, which most of these companies don't.
Yeah, and there's a couple of different variants of that. I mean, there's things like the Suron or the Talaria Sting that are definitely not legal unless you put plates on them and register them, if you can, depending on the state. The Los Angeles Police Department is actually cracking down on those, which is a good thing. But I see them everywhere. But then the harder part is to find the more normal-looking e-bikes that can go way faster than they should. And how do you enforce that? Because there's, the police don't know what they're looking at. None of them have been trained unless they already do that. LAPD does have a fleet of e-bikes, and those guys tend to be more knowledgeable, but most people don't. Most cops don't.
Yeah, I mean, that would really need to be addressed at point of sale, and that's, again, it's like one of these weird scenarios. There's a similar example in New York City right now where, so, the battery thing's been a big issue, so now everybody's switching to gas-powered mopeds. The problem is none of the gas-powered mopeds are being sold with license plates, and they're also primarily being ridden in bike lanes. And so a lot of these go 40, 50 miles an hour. And so technically the Department of Consumer and Workers Protection, which is kind of like a subsidiary of the Federal Trade Commission, is responsible to regulate this, but that's one of those scenarios where they said, we don't want to touch it. They caught a lot of flack for a long time in relation to these unregistered motorized scooters, because many people were saying that it's a civil rights issue, that, there's a lot of these, really underserved communities that are using them, and I totally get it. And the unfortunate reality right now is those are the communities that are actually being impacted the most, because they're being sold a product that's illegal by somebody that's likely telling them it's not illegal, and they're seeing them operated all over the place, so they believe that they're not illegal. And then so what ends up happening is NYPD ends up confiscating them. So many of these people, and one of the larger populations that's riding them right now are recent refugees, or that came across. They got shipped to New York. They can't work because they can't get working papers. There's a minimum 6-month wait, but the one thing they can do is like find some way to fake their way onto Uber Eats or DoorDash to work. So they spend the only money that they have to get one of these scooters, and within a short period of time, it could be taken away from them. So this is what's happening. And so that was a long-winded way of me kind of painting a bit of a picture of likely what's happening in other places where, maybe they have somebody that should be responsible for regulating this. I mean, it's like the internet thing. I mean, that's one of the biggest challenges. So this is in-person stores that there's like a physical representation. Think about if it's just being sold online and how challenging that, that aspect might be. They have challenges enough dealing with sales tax stuff. I mean, to deal with these kind of more complex issues, I think, again, it goes just back to, people being overwhelmed. But what ends up happening is the problem gets so great, and then we overregulate as a result of that. And I think that's likely what we're going to end up seeing.
Well, with the New York requirement for UL listing and testing, how would they enforce somebody going outside of New York and bringing something in?
So at the moment, there's no requirement for use. You can't sell it in person. You can't sell it online, which is kind of surprising. It was like, oh, wow, how do they have control over that? They found some way. I mean, I guess part of it, as I said, the Department of Consumer and Workers Protection is actually kind of a subsidiary of the Federal Trade Commission, so they do have connections there, and I think there are some abilities for them to get involved if need be. But that kind of brings up the bigger challenge. I mean, so one, they can go, the next county over to Nassau County on Long Island, or they can go to New Jersey, and it's not illegal to sell in either of these places. I suspect at a certain point there might be some sort of regulation on use. I think the city understands that it would be unfair to put in some sort of regulation like that right now, but I think they're going to give people plenty of opportunities to trade their bike in for a bike that is safe. So there's a pilot program going on that's being funded privately by Uber Eats and DoorDash, and we're helping to pilot this program, but not having that much success with it. But there's a bill in in city council right now to put some serious money behind this, and they're thinking to kind of model it somewhat after like a gun buyback program or these sort of things where you're basically, but the whole concept is you trade in your existing bike, you pay a small amount of money, but I think a lot of people are feeling like it needs to be pretty much free, that you can trade in your existing bike and get another bike. Right now, it's as low as $700 to trade in your existing bike, and you can get a new bike with 2 batteries, which the retail price on the bike is about $2,000. So,
All right, that's really good.
yeah.
And then another aspect of e-bikes, and we've had some discussions about this, getting service on an e-bike and being able to take it to a bike shop. And I was talking to one of the guys here, and they won't even work on it because the insurance is too high. What do those people do? What do you think, Rick?
I administer a Facebook group called Bicycle Industry Recovery, and we have about 1,000 retailers on that group, 1,500 by now. And this is a real concern for bike shops. They don't want to be left liable if something happens. They don't like to work on e-bikes they don't understand, that they haven't seen before, from brands they've never heard of. They have trouble getting support from the manufacturer, who may be off in China and doesn't even have a phone desk in the United States. So it's a real problem. At the same time, the consumer's got a product they paid for. They got a problem with it. They need to get it fixed. So no easy answers on that one.
Yeah, I mean, they'd have to train, people have to be trained on that particular system usually, right? Well, especially for Bosch. Chris?
Yeah, it's a challenge in that I think the consumer has no idea about when they generally are purchasing. As many of these people are there entering the market for the first time, and they're buying a product, sometimes $1,000, sometimes several $1,000s, and they don't realize that most shops are going to say, "I'm not touching it." I mean, really, the smart ones, that's what they're saying, because they could end up in a lot of trouble if not. I mean, talking about the product that gets shipped here directly from China, okay, there's nobody to sue in America aside for maybe the shop that touched it last. And that's generally how that works. So from my side, it's been a long time that we've said we only work on what we sell. And it's a challenging thing. I know we're leaving money on the table, but I'm trying to stay in this thing for the long run. It just, and I think so. What ends up happening is you have a lot more of these like independent guys. You have like these websites like VeloTooler or this sort of thing, or maybe I don't know if the VeloFix guys are doing it or whatever. But I think a lot of the traditional bike shops are not doing it, but maybe some of these newer guys that maybe are not understanding their potential liability or concerns. But the insurance thing, as mentioned, is a major issue in the e-bike space. There's very, very few insurance companies that will actually write insurance for an e-bike shop. I think there's probably 3 or 4 of them, out of the, 50 or so different insurance companies out there. And the others, I think they used to, but all of them say, I don't want that risk. This is a confusing space. I don't want to touch it, and it's just getting worse. So, yeah, it's a challenging thing for sure.
All right. People for Bikes is doing amazing work. They've set up the 3-class system and gotten that in most of the states now. Are they doing enough? Could they do more?
Well, they can always do more. The problem with the 3-class system is the consumers who are going to buy e-bikes have no idea what that is or what it means. They just know they want a bike with a throttle on it that they can take out. Yeah, you're saying, you're nodding in agreement, that they can take out and ride. And I'm not sure the 3-class system has much reality on the ground. when you look at the individual bike shop or e-bike shop.
All right. Any thoughts, Chris?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I definitely appreciate the work that they've done. I guess in a lot of ways, thinking about it, it's to some extent maybe we should have considered some of this stuff early on, right? Like, it's how do you know? I mean, I think that there probably was some foresight that some of these challenges might exist, but yeah, it's kind of scary. I think that part of the challenge is maybe a lot of these things, yeah, they do seem to be, springing up in New York, or there's a lot of things in California with kids on e-bikes and stuff like that. So they're all different in different environments, and but yeah, could they do more? Yeah, I mean, sure. I think we all need to do more as an industry. I often feel I feel like the industry in general needs to do more. I feel like brands need to do more. I think that there's a lot of brands that are they're definitely not doing what they could do to ensure rider safety and to like really ensure the longevity of the industry. And I don't totally blame them. I think that the bike industry in general, it seems to, I think there's a lot of companies are undercapitalized and they can't really think long term. And part of the reason why we work with Bosch exclusively is because they do think long term. They're able to. They're able. They're one of the largest privately held companies in the world, and they can think in 5-10 years from now. They're not thinking about like what's our quarterly earnings and how would this impact our quarterly earnings if we get this safety regulation, or if we take this other step that might be a little bit safer, or if we, I don't know. I mean, it's challenging to be, so tied to that and only motivated by that.
Agreed. I think you're onto something with maybe it needs to be education, because, if you've got somebody who's been cycling for a long time, most of the room, they're going to go in, they're going to get on an e-bike, understand it, and be able to ride it safely. But somebody who doesn't ride, that's getting this as one of their first bikes, doesn't understand the power, the weight, all of that. I mean, could there be even a nationwide teaching training program?
Well, the motorcycle industry has been very successful with on-site rider training. They went through a down period for a while where motorcycles were perceived as dangerous, and the Motorcycle Association said we need to address this. And one of the ways they addressed it was through rider education, and they have a very large and very successful program. I remember proposing in 2013 that the bicycle industry should be looking at this, and now that e-bikes have become such a big deal, it's even more important. You have a consumer who hasn't been on a bike. If they have been on a bike at all, they haven't been on a bike in 20 or 30 years. They're not comfortable handling that bike at 10 miles an hour, let alone 20 miles an hour, let alone on a hopped up bike at 35 or 40 miles an hour. And so it is very much the place of the industry to police ourselves and invest in rider skill development. And there's already a model for it in the motorcycle industry, and it's been very successful, and there's no reason we can't do it here, and that needs the support of a major group, and there's only one major group, and that's People for Bikes.
Yeah, I believe California actually had started. I think they passed a bill to put some money towards a statewide campaign for education. So hopefully that kind of all comes through, and then I imagine that will just basically be something that other states can just borrow off of. They don't need to reinvent the wheel. It's all more or less the same. But Yeah, I agree. The education could be a really big thing. I mean, there's just so much misunderstanding in the industry as far as like the consumer expectations around safety. That the government's going to protect me, or this brand is going to protect me, or whatever. But none of that's happening. It's just not. It's not how it works. And I think people. It's a new industry, so people have expectations from other industries to say, oh, well, the automotive industry, they have all these regulatory bodies and there's all this testing required and all this sort of stuff. Doesn't happen here, and I think, I mean, yeah, I believe that, some more education around that could be really helpful too, but I think there's not really too much financial motivation to do that, so I don't know who would actually be responsible for that. I mean, I guess CPSC could get into that, and I'm sure there's probably some legislation in the works in relation to that as well. But I mean, because that's going to be the other side of it. So once they likely make some additional requirements. I mean, there's all sorts of others, like just the standard requirements for a bicycle and and different brake systems and stuff like that. That's pretty, I mean, yeah, it's a challenging thing because, I love the bike industry, but I think, as we start to look at these more as vehicles and that sort of thing, we have to really start to evaluate where these fit into, where they fit into the product landscape, really, right?
Well, any additional thoughts before we take any potential questions?
Nothing for me.
Chris?
Yeah, I feel like I talked too long, so I'm happy to take questions. So.
Okay. I'll throw in one thing. For any of the bike companies out there that are putting out e-bikes and you're using an off-the-shelf charger, put a sticker with the name of your company and the model on the charger. This is one of the biggest things. There are so many chargers out there that have the same connector on them. And if you plug the wrong charger into the wrong bike or the wrong battery, you could have a problem. So that's my public service announcement. So any questions, guys?
Yeah, this will be for Rick, who's probably, if you remember, just listening to you guys talk about the sort of government reaction to e-bikes and kind of forces building against e-bikes. It sort of, what came to mind was back in mid-90s with government against mountain bikes and then the formation of IMBA. And I was just curious, Rick, what you thought, if you see any parallels in terms of what routes we learned and utilized through IMBA in terms of increasing mountain bike access that might be helpful in terms for the same bike industry that, as you well know, doesn't always take our lessons learned so well and apply them to the future, and apply that to what the levels of problems we're having with e-bikes right now.
Well, you raise a really good point. In fact, one that we probably should have covered here, which is e-bike access, which is a big topic that we've not even begun to stick our toes into. But right now, there is nothing that is the equivalent of IMBA, and there probably needs to be. So we need people advocating to get e-bike access on trails and on all kinds of surfaces where they're currently outlawed. So that would be an excellent idea and something the industry ought to be taking a sharp look at. But as with IMBA, it's not the industry that did it. It's individuals and activists doing it that put that infrastructure together to build an organization like IMBA. So good thought, Zap.
I think it's interesting to think about CPSC involvement in this problem. The bike industry as a whole doesn't pay attention to CPSC in any way, shape, or form. They're basically irrelevant. When it comes to standards of bicycles, the bicycle industry largely uses the ISO standard, which is a European standard. They test everything to that, and most companies that care about their product and care about the safety of its riders, mainly for insurance purposes, mainly for their liability in that product, they want to go above and beyond in testing. So they ignore the CPSC altogether. The CPSC standards for bicycles themselves are a joke. If you've ever seen them, there's still pictures of like stamped together dropouts that nobody uses anymore. And so I wonder why the industry from the e-bike standpoint is trying to count on the CPSC when they seem so far behind the curve in legislation anyway. I just seems like the wrong body to be involved in this problem. And it sounds like in New York, at least, with this law to outlaw any battery that's not UL certified is a great step of sidestepping the CPSC and saying we're going to implement laws that are actually relevant and on point today.
Yeah, if I can with that, that's a great point, and yeah, I could. So the CPSC, I think the reason why is because there's a precedent. So basically, there was an article that was out like a couple years ago or something about the hoverboards. There's a lot of discussion in the industry about hoverboards and how there's a parallel story here where basically hoverboards rose in popularity in 2015 and 2016, really the Christmas season specifically, and they grew rapidly, and there was a time where there was some report that basically 9 out of 10 had like serious safety hazards as far as the battery. And so CPSC actually, they made a requirement for UL, and basically overnight, nobody was allowed to sell them anymore. And they all got pulled off the shelves of major retailers and everything like that. And they've since been introduced, certainly not with the same popularity as they had at that time, but and now they're available with the UL requirement. To my understanding, I'm not sure if it was that or maybe other actions, but the CPSC no longer is going to act on their own, and they're actually requesting Congress to push them to act, which is a whole other, bureaucratic, like challenging situation, but it is what it is. But so basically, there's a bill currently to require CPSC to make this requirement. And I believe that part of the other thing with CPSC is that they could check the bikes at the border. And so that's one thing that the states and the cities and everybody else, they have no jurisdiction there. And that's the biggest thing that I believe is trying to be addressed by the CPSC thing is to stop the bikes at the border. But the de minimis thing, as mentioned before, is the other challenge in relation to that, because if the product is under $800, it doesn't go through customs unless they make some special exemption for e-bikes that they're required to be checked and everything like that. So it's a lot of weird things to navigate there, but yeah. So I'm not aware of anybody else that could do it. There's actually, interesting enough, Department of Homeland Security is getting involved in New York City in relation to the battery concerns. So maybe they could somehow be involved, but I don't know. But that's a pretty recent thing that I just had a conversation with the fire commissioner last week on that topic. So, but if you think about it, I mean, these are serious threats, and especially in big apartment buildings. It's like that's the biggest concern. It's sometimes difficult to conceptualize it. Sometimes in these like more like open spaces and stuff like that. But when you have massive apartment buildings, many of which are not maintained properly, and they don't have really proper fire safety standards in place, and the whole building's going up in fire, in minutes, sometimes less.